I'd like to call the meeting of the Virginia Marine Resources Commission to order. We're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance and the invocation by Mr. Tanker.
Face the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let us pray. As we gather today, the Commission acts as stewards of both God's natural resources and our Commonwealth's rule of law. We ask that our deliberations and decisions be honest and forthright. All are treated equally. For this we pray. Amen.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July 26, 2022 Marine Resources Commission meeting. I have a couple new faces up here you guys might notice. Mr. Erskine to my left, he's a familiar face, obviously, been here before. Welcome, Mr. Erskine, to the board. Mr. Erskine works for Coward Seafood Corporation since 2005 in Bevins and helped develop the oyster aquaculture program. And they're a vertically integrated company, operate extensive aquaculture operations, some of the largest on the East Coast. And we have Ms. Kellum to my right. Welcome back. Familiar face. Ms. Kellum is the president of Ampro Shipyard and Diesel. She previously served on this board as well. And she also sits on the board of Chesapeake Bank, Reedville Fishermen's Museum, and Rappahannock Westminster's Canterbury. Thank you very much for serving, guys. All right, first item on the agenda, we have a approval of the agenda that we have here, President. There's a motion. So moved. Motion by Mr. Minor to approve the agenda. A second.
A second.
A second by Mr. Branson. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Let the record
Mr.
show
Commissioner.
Mr. Branson not here.
One abstention.
And one abstention is Mr. Erskine. Next, approval of the minutes from the June 28th, 2022 commission meeting. Are there any corrections, deletions, or changes from commission members or staff to the minutes?
Yes, sir.
That being said, is there a motion to approve the
Move to
minutes?
approve the minutes as presented.
A motion from Mr. Tanker.
Second.
Second by Mr. Minor. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, next we're going to swear in the VMRC staff and VIM staff that will be speaking and presenting testimony at the meeting. You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Thank you. All right, I guess we'll get, is there any announcements? There being no announcements, I guess we'll move on to the permits, Mr. Owen.
Mr. Green, members of the commission, good morning. I'd like to take a second just to welcome back Mr. Erskine and Ms. Kellum. There's a new face on Habitat. Tony did retire. I'd like to ask our staff to stand up. On the end is Justin. He's the new deputy chief for the division. I always like to point out the old guys. So Jay and Jeff in the back, they've been here as long as I have. Brad on the right is our compliance officer. Mark liked us so much he came back. He left us and came back. But the three young people in front there, Lauren, Tiffany, and Ben, they're all former Virginia Sea Grant Commonwealth Fellows. We were lucky enough to grab them all. Lauren has a master's in public policy from William & Mary. Ben was twice a fellow. He worked under the last administration up, with the secretary. And Tiffany saved the best for last. I have a little bias. She is a product of ODU's ichthyology lab, which I are one too. So I'm happy to have them all. And I wanted to, have Mr. Erskine, Ms. Kellum. We know that you know what we do for a living, but if you have any questions from Habitat, please don't hesitate to call them directly or call me, and I'll hook you up with the right people. Thank you. Moving on to the page 2 items. Thank you. We have 3 cases. These are the cases that are over $500,000 in cost. They have no objections after running the standard public interest review, and they're carrying staff's recommendation for approval. Item 2A, the Department of Conservation and Recreation is requesting authorization to dredge 2,600 cubic yards of material, remove 3 wooden piers, piles, and wave screens, to construct 2 new 10-in piers with screens and a fixed pier, as well as a gangway and floating dock to facilitate the repair and replacement of the public boat ramp at York River State Park, Croker Landing, along the York River in James City County, and we all recommend approval. The dredge material will be removed to an upland disposal site. Item 2B, Loudoun County, Loudoun Water is requesting authorization to install a 30-inch steel case sanitary sewer force main across a 50-foot section of Cycling Creek, 4 feet beneath the substrate, using the cofferdam and open trench method adjacent to Cochran Mill Road in Loudoun County. We'll recommend approval with the standard in-stream conditions and an in-stream work time restriction of October 1 to March 31 to protect the state-threatened wood turtles. Item 2C, Chesterfield County Transportation Department is requesting authorization for a temporary causeway for construction access to realign 174 linear feet of Blackman Creek to facilitate the construction of a new two-span bridge that will replace the existing clear span bridge across the creek along Otterdale Road in Chesterfield County. We'll recommend approval with the standard in-stream conditions. I'm available for any questions you have, sir.
Any questions?
Yes, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
On the Loudoun County, the water, we recommend a time of year restriction. Are they all right with that?
My understanding is that they are. I'm sorry, Claire is on leave today, and it's our understanding that they are in agreement with. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Any more questions from Board? Rusto? Any speakers here in support of the items 2A through 2C? Anyone here for opposition? Any speakers in opposition to these items? For or against? All right. Here's the matters before the commission.
Move to approve page 2 items.
Motion from Mr. Tanker to approve page 2 items.
Second.
Second, Mr. Headley. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Carried. Thank you, Red. All right, consent agenda items. Each 3 items.
Yes, we have one item, item 3A. Eastern Branch Holdings, LLC, is requesting after-the-fact authorization to retain a 16-foot wide by 263-foot long floating pier with a gangway ramp and an 18-foot by 42-foot concrete abutment. That was actually approved by the Wetlands Board. It's in their jurisdiction. On the shoreline property adjacent to Eastern Branch, Elizabeth River, in the city of Norfolk. This is the old Ford plant property. The applicant has agreed to pay a $3,000 civil charge, a triple royalty of $25,248 in lieu of further enforcement action. This violation was undertaken by the applicant, who stated that the work was performed to provide upgrades to a temporary barge dock that was also in use without the required VMRC permit. The dock is used to support their operations, which supplies construction materials to the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel expansion project. When staff questioned them on site why they moved without the permit, they stated that they proceeded because they had to make a business decision at a time when many governmental offices were closed during COVID. As the commission knows, we were not closed during COVID. I was the one that was coming in the building and handling all of the applications and scanning them and getting them to our office manager. So we actually went digital and never closed as far as that goes. So we were available to receive any application that would have come in. So we are recommending after-the-fact approval with a $3,000 civil charge, which the applicant has consented to, triple permit fees, and a tripled royalty of $25,000 and $25,248 in lieu of further enforcement action. I'm available for any questions you may have.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
Randy, on the agenda, it says triple royalty fees of $4,525.20. Can you explain, please?
Say
Can you
again?
explain that for us, please? Why
Yes,
difference
the,
in number?
so we have a civil charge matrix. On the XY axis, the degree of environmental impact is minimal. It's essentially steel hollow pilings holding a floating dock. The degree of deviation we consider is maximum. They knew better. They should have gotten a permit, and they did not. They stated they made a business decision to proceed. So we're recommending the assessment of the maximum civil charge for a minimal degree of environmental damage and a major degree of deviation from the permit, which is $3,000. The code allows us to assess, the commission to assess triple permit fees and triple royalties when there is a violation. In this case, we think it's appropriate. So the square footage times the $2 normal square foot royalty for a commercial dock would be tripled. That's why you have it at $25,248. And we would recommend that the $600 permit fee be tripled to $1,800.
Any questions from Mr. Owen from the commission? Mr. Hurst?
Randy, so the applicant had other permits approved with this project or in previous projects?
Well, we are prepared to brief you fuller. It was discovered by the Norfolk staff. They've already been to the Norfolk Wetlands Board for after-the-fact approval, who directed them to submit the after-the-fact application. They did pay a civil charge for the intertidal work that was within the Wetlands Board's jurisdiction. They're now before you for the subaqueous component, and it's my understanding that, I don't know, Ben, whether the Corps' permit has been issued or not, but that would be the final federal approval.
Okay. Thank you.
Chief, so I understand that they didn't just not get permitting from the commission, they also didn't get it from the Wetlands Board in Norfolk. Were there any other permitting that they?
The federal permit, the Corps of Engineers, they just did the work. They didn't apply, they just went out and constructed the dock, and it was discovered by the Norfolk staff. And then, since the Wetlands Board directed them to file the after-the-fact application, that is how it landed on our doorstep.
Ms. Calvin?
Does the applicant have any other history of issues like this?
They do. They were brought before the Hampton Ridge Bridge Tunnel quarterly environmental meeting last fall. They installed an unauthorized barge platform out there with steel hollow pilings. We asked them to come to that meeting where, they were to explain why they did that work. They did that outside of the authority of the permit that this commission issued for the Hampton Ridge Bridge Tunnel expansion. They also did it during the acoustic study that VCU is conducting that was in concert with both the North Fisheries and the VMRC recommendations. So it caused quite the stir back then as well.
Any other questions? Thank you, Randy.
Yes.
Any speakers in support of this project? Any speakers in opposition? Is the applicant present? You have anything you would like to say?
Not really, sir. I
Commissioner,
apologize.
you guys have any questions for the applicant?
Yes, I have one question.
Come up to the podium, please. Please state your name for the record in the microphone and raise your right hand, please.
Michael Troutman.
You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
So Mr. Owen mentioned that this was a business decision that you made to just go forward without any permitting. Is this the way you intend to continue to do business in the future in the Commonwealth?
No, sir. No, sir. We've gotten permits in the past. This all happened at the beginning of COVID. We had a dock barge there. The dock barge wasn't sufficing. It was during COVID, and I apologize. I did make that statement. It was very hard to get a hold of everybody. We were developing a permit. You'll see us again in front of you. We're developing a request for a permit to a bunch of other bulkheads on the waterfront and boat ramp and different things. We were going to submit for this boat ramp at the same time Timmons Group is working on that. So I'm not gonna lie to you, I knew I should have had a permit before we put it in. We had a serious problem with all the tugboats when we were going. It was unsafe where we were keeping them. I kind of said, let's just, it was manufactured, it was sitting there, I said, let's put it in, and we'll get the permit when we do the rest of the bulkhead and stuff. And, bad decision on my part.
It's a follow-up question, if I could. Are you okay with the civil charge on the triple royalty, paying that?
How can I not be? I screwed up.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Pardon my French.
Any more questions from the board for the applicant? Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Matters before the commission. Sir, Mr. Tanker.
Yes, sir, I'll move to approve page 3 item.
Motion to approve, do I have a second? Second. Second from Mr. Minor. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Four, closed meeting with consultation with council. Do we need a closed meeting?
We do not.
We do not need a closed meeting. That is good. We're moving right along. Item number 5, Mr. Stagg. Morning. Morning, sir.
A couple of housekeeping items related to this project. This project was on the agenda back in May. It was pulled the morning of the meeting, as we discovered earlier that morning that the notice to some of the adjacent property owners was defective. We did a mailing in February, and apparently that entire batch of mail that was sent related to this did not get delivered to any of the protestants. So in fairness to them, we pulled it off the agenda, made sure they got all the information about the application, and it's now back on the agenda this month. In front of you is, not in your book, are two things. There's a letter that we received, too late to go into the record, but it is in the database, it is uploaded. It's a protest letter. And then there's a copy of a PowerPoint presentation of one of the protestants that they wish to submit today. They'll have a PowerPoint on the screen. And I told Mr. Headley this morning he was special. They specifically asked that he be given a copy of the PowerPoint. So he has a color version, and the rest of you have a black and white. But color ink costs a lot of money. So if you need a color one, you'll have to borrow his. But you'll see it if the protestants speak. They have the presentation, and it's preloaded on the computer. So having said that, we'll get underway. This is a joint permit application from Little Wicomico Oyster Company. They are requesting authorization to install in 3 locations a floating bag system of oyster aquaculture floats. This would be within the Little Wicomico River near Hanson's Cove. It's in Northumberland County. It is upstream of the Little Wicomico Oyster Company's facility, which is on the opposite side of the river from where these would be, and just downstream. So the original application included Site 1, which was indicated to be a 200 by 400 foot area, which would have 20 horizontal lines, 200 feet in length, with 130 bags per line. Site 2 was proposed to encompass an area of 300 feet by 500 feet, with 30 horizontal lines, 300 feet in length, with 200 floats per line. And then Site 3 would encompass a 250 foot by 700 foot area, with 35 horizontal lines, 250 feet in length, with 160 bags per line. The request was subjected to our public interest review, and we did receive a number of protests from nearby residents and from the immediately affected adjacent property owners. We also received 6 letters in support of the project as well. They're all part of the record. So the project is located in the Little Wicomico River, which is the northernmost river in Virginia before you turn the corner to go into the Potomac River. This is a topo map that shows our leases, public grounds, and the site is near the upper reaches of Little Wycomico River. The mouth is right at the Virginia-Maryland line where you see the two dashed lines, and those are jetties that protect the man-made channel into the river. So here's an aerial photo with our oyster leases superimposed and approximate general center locations of each site, sites 1, 2, and 3. Site 1, that little stream to the left, is Hanson's Cove. Site 2 is just an embayment of the river, as well as Site 3. The Little Wycomico Oyster Company facility is shown there in the center of the slide in the lower part, and consists of some marina slips and a number of oyster floats as well at that facility that have been previously permitted. The lease that these 3 sites are over is owned by the applicant. So this is the type of bags that would be used in this. So this is just a typical from the Zapco, the company that makes these bags. They're mesh bags. They have a floating apparatus on them, so they can be flipped for cleaning purposes. And the bottom pictures are just typical examples of what these would look like when they're deployed. They would be anchored at each end with screw anchors into the bottom if approved as requested. So we did subject this to our normal public interest review, which included a public notice in the newspaper. We did repeatedly attempt to notify the nearby property owners, and we were successful at some point with that. We did receive a number of objections from just some residents in the area and from the immediately adjacent property owners along the western shore. As we'll progress through the slides, you'll see those. The nature of the objections were various, but they include potential adverse impacts to navigation, potential limited access from the water to the highland properties or from the highlands out into the water, other uses of the waterway for recreation and fishing and boating, viewshed concerns from upland property owners, and the potential for adverse property value impacts if these were deployed. So this is Site 1, and this is, as you see, Hanson's Cove. This is the drawing from the application. It shows the 200 by 400 foot area with the arrow is what they propose is the general navigation in and out of the cove. This is Site number 2, which is the middle site in that middle cove. Again, approximately 300 by 500 feet. And it would fit into that cove area. Again, with the arrow showing general navigation. You can see the deeper water here in the sandbar areas in the photo. This is Site 3, which is the most southern downstream. The Little Wycomico facility is just on the corner of the screen at the bottom. Again, this one is approximately 250 by 700 feet. And again, the line of navigation as depicted by the agent for the applicant. So staff discovered well into the process that those 3 drawings you saw were not really correct when you mapped them based on the latitude and longitudes you see on each corner. We mapped them with our own AutoCAD system, and as you can see, they're not rectangles. They're more like trapezoids. The dimensions are on there, so they're slightly skewed from what the original drawing showed. When we discovered this, we sent this additional information to the adjacent property owners, so it was clear that the dimensions were not quite what they were seeing visually in the original maps. So this is, again, our mapping with an aerial photo with those same corrected areas as they would appear in the real world on the ground or on the water. And we sent both these maps to the adjacent property owners that own the properties here. So there's 2 primary property owners along this western shore. One owns the area in Hanson's Cove and some of that point. Then there's another property owner that owns that wooded tract. It's kind of this area right here. So he's impacted by these 2 and the other property owner is impacted by Site 1. So during the public interest review and near the time of the meeting, we did receive some additional information from a nearby property owner indicating the presence of what she believed was SAV in Hanson's Cove. When we reviewed this, we always review every application, and that's part of the review process of VIM's mapped SAV, and there was no mapped SAV on the VIM's data. However, the picture she sent was pretty clear that there's definitely an SAV in there. So this is actually horned pondweed, which I'll have to admit, even I didn't know as much about it as I probably should. It's not a typical SAV that we talk about in projects we have because it's more freshwater type SAV, but this is probably up in the headwaters of Hanson's Cove where there's probably a lot of freshwater input. I did speak to VIMS and got them to provide comments. They are in your packet. They admitted that they're seeing more of this in Virginia in areas like this where upper areas of tidal streams, and that there is an ongoing debate within VIMS of possibly starting to map this as part of their SAV coverage. The bottom line is they recommended, it does have value, as most SAVs do, for habitat and other reasons. So they did recommend that we not permit anything right over top of it. It is my understanding that the Site 1 is not where this grass is, but it is in Hanson's Cove. So we have no additional recommendation related to that. But you may start seeing this in some future applications that may impact this where we haven't been, it's not mapped and we haven't seen it before. So we do consider each case on a case-by-case basis, considering all the requirements of the Code of Virginia. And as I've stated repeatedly in the past, the use of aquaculture enclosure type gear for shellfish propagation has resulted in an increased public awareness of such activity, and it's also highlighted the necessity for a comprehensive review of these methods related to each application. Such requests in populated areas often raise issues regarding public trust, to include user conflicts, property values, aesthetics, navigation, and suitable bottom types. Stewardship of the public trust lands, while weighing the public and private benefits versus detriments, requires a balanced approach to review of such permits. Review of aquaculture apparatus within the water column and on the water surface presents an additional challenge beyond those of previous methods of shellfish cultivation on the bottom. With increased interest in using both the water column and surface waters for shellfish propagation, in addition to bottom culture methods, we've seen a lot of new user conflicts arise. As for general navigation in the area, this is another, from the application drawing, they provided this to show some of the just general depths in the area. That box encapsulates the three areas, starting with the 5.9, that's the first area. And then the next 5.9 to the north would be the middle one, and then Hanson's Cove is up near the 3.9. That's not a very good indication of the actual real contours and depths. This is a chart which is a little better, still not great. The three sites are Hanson's Cove here and here. The shoreline is not quite as defined here as some of the photos you saw. There is deep water here. There's no problem navigating in and out of this, this area. However, putting a lot of gear along this western side does have some potential impacts to navigation, and I'll address those a little more later in my eval. The other thing to consider here is, as you're probably aware, we have a regulation now that we do not accept new applications for leases in grounds that are currently restricted classification by the health department, which raises a conundrum for floating aquaculture gear as to what the commission's policy should be regarding permitting this type of activity in waters where we won't lease the bottom. So these three sites are all currently in a condemned shellfish area. It's not condemned to the point that you can't relay out of it. You can. So the existing lease, which predates our regulatory ban on new leases, you can grow oysters, and they can be relayed from this lease to clean waters for eventual harvest. And in these areas, you can certainly grow seed oysters as well and move them while they're still seed, and that is legally allowed as well. But it does present some issues of intensive aquaculture like this within polluted waters, and again, I'll address that a little bit more in the final recommendation. But I wanted the commission to be aware. So I think you all understand these maps, but the striped line is restricted. The little stippled area is seasonally condemned, which means it's open certain times of the year and closed certain times. The health department now has a lot of areas that have rainfall closure areas as well. And then they're open except when there's a more than an inch of rain within a 24-hour period, and they close them for some period of days to allow that to clear up. Unfortunately, during the processing of this last week, we did get a letter from a nearby resident with some objections to the project and a question about the existence of floats already in this area. And I had previously visited the site in June of this year to do a site visit for this meeting. And the applicant does have bottom bags on this lease that are anchored to the bottom, and they have floats similar to what you see right here at the end of each line, so they can find each row. And that's what was up there in June when I went. So I questioned the person that sent this picture in, and of course I didn't have the picture initially, and said, you know, I think you might be talking about bottom enclosures. And even when I got this picture, I said, well, is it low tide and these are bottom bags and you're just laying on the bottom and they're just sticking up above the water? But they do look like these floating bags. Anyway, I had law enforcement visit the site last week, and these were actually floating bags like the applicant is asking for within the Hanson Cove area. So that's site 1. Law enforcement did contact the applicant, and they did receive a summons for having these floats in an area that was not authorized. So these should not have been in this area. There's been no permit issued up here for these floats. Unfortunately, also last year in 2021, I got a call from one of the adjacent property owners here that there were floats up against their shoreline, and they had some issues with that. So I called the applicant and said, do you have any floats up there? And first he said he didn't, but then I said, well, I'm pretty sure you do, because I talked to the landowner. And he said, oh yes, I do have a few floats up there. And I asked why, and he said, well, he'd run out of room. And I said, and this applicant knows the permit process. And I said, well, you can't just put floats wherever you feel like it. You have to have a permit. He agreed to address the situation, which he did. He either removed them and moved them to a legal spot, or he sank them to the bottom, which was allowed on a lease. You can have up to 12-inch enclosures on a lease. But they were in 3 locations, and they're kind of hard to see in his photo, but Hanson's Cove, again, is right here. Site 2 is here, Site 3 is here. And in 2021, and this just happens, we have an aerial photo that actually shows them, there were floats here, here, and here. So this is a little closer view of the northern area, so these are all floats, quite a few of them. Right opposite Hanson's Cove. This is where Site 3 is now, and this was where I got the complaint. I believe was the landowner that called me. And again, the issue was taken care of, but unfortunately, this is 2 times that the applicant has put floats in without a permit. So based on that, staff has serious concerns about whether we can recommend approval of this application. Based on both recent and past actions or lack of action by the applicant related to their ongoing operations, we do have difficulty recommending approval of this or other pending similar applications the applicant has with proposed conditions below, which I'll explain in a moment. We do lack confidence that if granted the permit, even with conditions, that the applicant will faithfully follow them, thereby possibly requiring considerable future staff time both from the Shellfish Division and law enforcement to assure compliance. Therefore, our actual primary recommendation here is denial of the entire permit request. However, should the commission deem that any of these three areas are approvable, we do have a secondary recommendation, and I want to go over that just so you have that information as well. And this would have been my recommendation up until this most recent violation of the code. So staff looked at this pretty seriously. We tried to look at the concerns of the adjacent property owners and general public concerns about navigation. So we would suggest, if permitted, and I'm going to show you a staff recommended modified areas in a moment, but generally, if you permit any of this, these would be the permit conditions we would recommend be included. That all the areas, if approved, are marked with danger buoys along the channelward side to warn the public of the floats. Now, they do float on the surface, so you can see them, but the public still needs to be warned that there are floats and anchors in this area. On the inshore side, each midpoint along the inshore boundary and each corner should be marked with some type of signage indicating aquaculture activity. As with all aquaculture type permits, we recommend a surety bond equal to the number of apparatus, which is typically $15 per device, but in this instance, the bags are much smaller than the typical device. We originally came up with this fee, which was a Taylor float sized float. So we equate this, 4 bags would equal a Taylor float. So it would be for every 4 bags, there would be a $15 bond requirement, and I'll break those numbers down at the end. Additionally, if eventually the Army Corps of Engineers permits this pursuant to any Coast Guard request, and this is for us as well, we have not received any comments back from the Coast Guard about marking on this, but if there are any, that those should be maintained for the life of the permit. We also recommend a condition that should any adjoining landowner to these 3 request a pier or improve their properties where they need additional access to and from the land from water, that the permittee will agree in advance to remove all floats within an appropriate area for construction and access to those future piers. Additional recommendations. We also recommend a permit condition that only seed oysters be grown in this permitted area, and this relates to the classification of the water. Unless that classification is changed to open, non-restricted, we would recommend a permit condition that no market size oysters be relayed out of this area while they're in restricted status. The applicant has indicated in the application that they only intend to grow seed at these 3 sites, but we feel that a permit condition to enforce that would be recommended that only seed will be grown here. So they will be grown here for a very short period of time and moved somewhere else for more grow out in the future. We also now recommend 3 sites. Site 1 be reduced in size, and I'll have a map of this in a second, beginning along the current proposed inshore southwest corner, which would be the corner up into Hanson's Cove the most, along the shore, extending out no more than 450 feet to the east, and that each inline be perpendicular to that line and extend no more than 150 feet. This would create an area of 67,500 square feet. Site 2, we don't recommend any change to what was requested. That site is 132,396 square feet. Site 3, which is the furthest south, we recommend again reducing the size of that, the offshore side, by holding the inshore line as proposed, which is actually mapped based on the latitude and longitude offered by the applicant, 849 feet in length, and extended 175 feet on each end, which would create a rectangle, which would be 148,575 square feet. And again, before any permits issued, that the permittee provide accurate revised drawings that reflect whatever areas the commission may approve. So this is the alternate staff recommendation should you deem any of the project permitting is warranted. So these are accurate depictions of the revised staff areas. So starting with site 1, this area is now smaller. It's been pushed to the south. We held the inshore line and made it a rectangle. And these are the correct state plane and latitude and longitude values. Site 2 would be unchanged from the original request, albeit the drawing is correct here. It is not a rectangle, it is these actual dimensions. And Site 3, further south, would also be reduced. This did go out further to the east, would be reduced. It also would be made into an actual rectangle that's 175 foot wide and 849 feet long. So for Site 1, if you would accept staff's secondary recommendation, the royalty would be $337.50. For Site 2, it would be $661.98, and Site 3, it would be $742. So that total of all of that staff recommendation, secondary recommendation, would be $1,742.36 annually, royalty. We would recommend the surety bond based on numbers of bags the applicant has provided to me based on this revised area that we sent them. This is the amount of bond that would be required, $42,780 bond. That's based on that number of bags, 11,408 divided by 4, because 4 bags equals 1 device. So that would be 2,852 devices times 15. If you were to approve what was originally asked for, as they asked without any staff adjustment, then the royalty would be $2,063.09 based on a larger area of 412,617 square feet, and the bond amount would be $53,250. So staff's primary recommendation related to the past history of non-compliance is to deny the application. The secondary application would be, the secondary recommendation would be this modified areas to address navigation and other issues related to the objections we received. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Any questions from the commission? Mr. Stagg?
Yes, sir. Chief, I got a few questions.
Sure.
You said that you showed the map, in 2021, the satellite map that had the blue arrows, those bagged oysters, did you have anyone inspect those? Were they seed oysters, market oysters? Was it a restricted area back then?
We didn't, no, I did not do any, there was no inspection that I know
Okay.
of. The applicant was contacted by phone. He agreed to remove them or sink them onto the lease, and I have no additional information on whether they was, he can probably address that, but I don't know if they were seed, market size, and I don't know for sure what the water status was, but I believe it was restricted in 2021.
And I'd just like to make an observation here at that point, you just had your pointer on it, a little bit further down, that point right there, the shoaling around that eastern point on the other side, right there.
Right.
The applicant showed their blue navigation line, and I saw the nautical chart you showed about 3 feet around that point, if you can go back to that satellite image we had.
Right.
But I just want to point out that there's a significant amount of more shoaling off of that point right there than what would be indicated in that. So I'm not sure if that navigation line, to me, looking at the other satellite view, is entirely accurate. You can see it pretty well there, right there on that point. So that's one observation. And your staff went up there and did surveys of each one of these original applications. That's how you found out the drawings were not exactly correct?
We actually mapped the lat longs we had, and as soon as we mapped them, we realized they weren't rectangles for sure. So we knew something was not quite right with them, and we got in touch with the agent and worked on that to get it resolved.
Did you do any surveys at all in person up there, in there, looking for subaquatic vegetation or
The day I went up, we didn't go into Hanson's Cove, so that vegetation may have been there. We didn't go around this corner right here. We went up to about right here, just so I could observe. And part of the reason we went up there was not just to look at this for this application, but we had gotten a call from this landowner that there were floats This was previous to the last week getting that notice. This was prior to that. So we went up with the applicant, we went in the applicant's boat, and we went to this site and this site, and there are floats that look like crab pot floats, a lot of them, because he's got a lot of lines up there. And that's what the gentleman was actually talking about. So he went up there in a boat, and he wasn't sure he could go into the shore because he was confused about what is it that's here. And there were no signs. That was the other problem. This was not marked properly saying aquaculture activity. Bottom enclosures up to 12 inches are allowed on a lease without a permit, but they're supposed to be marked. The active worker is supposed to be marked, warning the public that there's something there. So I understood his concern, and I confirmed with the applicant that no, these are, we saw them, they were bottom bags, they were on the bottom, they had floats on each end, and you could maneuver over them, but the point that Mr. Crowther made, who's the property owner, is that he wasn't sure whether he should go in there or not.
But that is allowed to sink the floats as long as they're within 12 inches of the bottom.
That's
and
right.
they're properly marked.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. When they relay seed oysters as the applicant request, who monitors that they're seed oysters, and when he relays out, how long do they have to stay in clean
Well,
water?
the commissioner might be able to help you with this one some, but
I know in
seed,
summertime it's longer, but
if, as long as the oysters are 6 months or more from market, seed can be moved around with less restrictions from law enforcement. If you're moving market-size oysters out of a restricted area, that is done under direct supervision. You have to have a permit. It's done under direct supervision of law enforcement. Seed can be moved without all of that mechanism.
Go ahead, Ms. Callum.
Could you clarify what the definition of a seed oyster is? Can a 2-inch oyster be a seed oyster and a
Well,
market oyster?
Andrew Button and I have concerns about that. I might get him up here because I might misspeak on this, but this is a conundrum in a lot of states, including Virginia. I believe our definition is still 6 months from market, but private leases, there is no size. So, you know, you could sell an oyster that's almost any size if you have somebody that's willing to buy it, a restaurant, but I'll let him.
Yep, no, that's correct. So our definition from sort of not prohibited waters, but restricted waters, there's no minimum size for seed, but it's 6 months from human consumption. If it's containerized, it can be moved without law enforcement. But if it's being moved loose or is going to be consumed sooner than that 6 months, then that would require relay. And we don't allow harvest from any prohibited waters. So that's where the National Shellfish Sanitation Program guidelines come in. We have a minimum size. If it's actually prohibited waters, like, for example, around a sewage treatment plant, that's where that minimum size for seed comes in.
I think Ms. Kellum's question, is there a maximum size?
No.
No, not a maximum size.
Questions for Mr. Stagg? Mr. Arskin?
Ben, I appreciate the presentation. I had a question about some of the applicant's previous permits for floating bags. Is it in this same area or vicinity, or does he have permits
Yeah, I
in
can-
other systems?
That's a good question. So just to the south here is the Little Wacomico facility. He had a prior permit there for floats. Unfortunately, he also exceeded that and had floats outside his permitted area. But he did fix those temporarily. He applied to expand that area to some of the area he'd already expanded into. That is all properly permitted, and he has a lot of floats at the facility. We also have permitted a couple of flupsies at the facility, the larger. We just issued fairly recently a permit in the Great Wacomico near the Girl Scout camp. He's in that process of actually putting gear in that site, so he has a permit there. He was denied a permit a couple of years ago, I guess it's been now, maybe, at the Sunnybank Ferry site, which is in the Little Wacomico. He does have a floating site near Sharps Creek that was issued 3 years ago. It's fully, not fully, but it's a lot of floats deployed there and have been for a number of years. And those we haven't had any issues with. He has 2 or 3 at least more pending applications in other areas, some of which we're processing all of those that haven't been issued yet. I think 3 of them are not protested at the moment, so it looks good that we might be able to administratively issue those. There is one in Cockrell's Creek near the Omega plant that is heavily protested and is quite problematic for a lot of reasons. It's polluted, it's a lot of protest, but we're still working on that one as well with the applicant. So we have been inundated with quite a few applications from this applicant within the last 2 years. We are processing them as fast as we can. This one had some issues with the drawings and some other issues, so, but the applicant does have permits in other areas. Compliance, again, has been, we've had complaints a lot in the Little Wacomico Rock Hole area, Hole Creek. Some of those instances, law enforcement investigated and everything was in compliance. They were mostly bottom cages. But in some instances, they weren't. One instance, there were bottom cages outside the lease on vacant bottom, which is not legal without a permit. And the marking on some of them was inadequate as well for intensive agriculture activity. So this is why staff has come to the recommendation today that we have difficulty supporting this. Our recommendation was going to be the secondary recommendation until the event happened last week. And we have worked diligently with the applicant on past issues. Very cooperative, fixes the problem, but the problem is we don't need to be fixing the problem. He needs to do it right initially. So this latest incident, and he'll explain to you what happened with this latest one, and I understand it, but it still happened, and it's his company. So that's, I hope that answers your question, but he
Yeah.
does, and this applicant has a lot of leased ground in either Little Wacomico or in the Cockrell name. So they do have a lot of ground that they can use, and I understand certain areas are suitable for floating and some aren't, and et cetera. But, and he grows a good product, and he's a good operation, generally speaking. Every time I've been to his site, everything looks great. It's a clean operation. And he's, you know, he's got a good product. So it's not staff's intention to try to damage his company, but he also needs to follow the rules that the commission has, the staff's opinion. So.
Mr. Commissioner, follow-up?
Sir.
I wanted to touch on the Shellfish Condemnation Map that you put up, and I think that was July 15, 2021 was the evaluation, so it's scheduled to have a reevaluation. Have you been in touch with the health department to see if there was any change to that condemnation?
And it is possible, and I've talked to Cockrell about it, that this line can move up here, and, I mean, it is possible this could open. This could be back open. That's why we thought the permit condition was fair. He said he's just gonna grow seed here, that this is really an area better for growing seed than grow out, probably because of how far up in the creek it is. And we have no problem if this is open and you permit this and he wants to grow market size oysters here, that's fine. But because we don't allow leasing here anymore and you'd have to relay market off of lease, that we felt like maybe it's better to just, if we permit this, it has to be seed. You just don't even think about trying to grow market size oysters here. Okay. Unless it's open, and if it's open, it's open. So.
Thank you.
Mr. Taggart.
Mr. Dagg, this Little Wacomico area looks to me a bit different than some of the other areas we've permitted with regard to floating cages. I mean, this seems super restricted, tight, close. I mean, is that my imagination? This doesn't look like what we've permitted in other applications. The geography seems quite a bit different.
Well, if I interpret what you're saying, I would first say at this particular site, the river is relatively narrow to start with.
Right.
It's not as wide as some areas. Now, it gets wider as you go down, and where we permit them at Sharps Creek, it is wider than this. It's not a real large water body. It's not real wide. The kind of unique thing about this one is it's actually not where people live. You know, there are no houses here adjacent to any of these, which you would think would make it an ideal site. Maybe not to the people that own the land there, even though it's basically silviculture is what I think all of this land currently is under. It's just trees are being grown on it. but it does have potential for development. And I certainly can sympathize with the landowners that should they want to develop this or peer out, that these 3 sites are kind of problematic with doing that. So, so it is unique in some ways, but in other ways, it's like other places. The nature of the protests are similar here to areas that are more populated. There are, it's not in this photo, but to the north, there are houses to the north and there are boats. I think Mr. Branson and I discussed that, how many were up there, but at least a couple dozen properties that have either a pier or have water access. So there's not a huge amount of boating traffic up here, but there is boating traffic, so navigation is also a concern here. So the typical things that we hear, navigation, view, and aesthetics, and property value impacts.
So follow-up, so if, would it be your estimation that the property owner, I guess this is the Blenheim Limited, they would have a difficult time navigating off their property?
Right, so they own a pretty large piece of property, but it does come out, in my understanding, and looking at the tax maps, and they have a presentation, is that, yeah, they consider this spot kind of problematic because this is the deepest area of water that they own. They don't own to the south of this much. That's the next property owner. So, I mean, this would be a prime site to put a pier, I would think, if you wanted to access this property, would be right here, which is why we definitely thought that permit condition was warranted, that if any development takes place where they need access to the water, that the applicant would just have to vacate that area.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any further questions for Mr. Stagg? Is the applicant present? Would you like to speak? Come forward, please. Please state your name in the microphone clearly for the record. Raise your right hand.
Miles Cockrell, Little White Comic Oyster Company.
You swear to tell the truth and the whole truth?
Yes, sir.
Proceed.
Claudette LaJoy, I'm the agent for the applicant.
Raise your right hand. You swear to the whole truth, tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
Proceed.
First, thank you to everyone for your time. We know this is the second time we've been here. The first time was a little bit out of our control. Like Mr. Stagg said in his presentation, there was a concern that the adjacent property owners did not receive the batch of letters. So we postponed that so everyone could be contacted. Throughout the process, we have been working with staff. I will take responsibility for the mapping, initial mistakes. I was giving you the general site dimensions versus the exact point dimensions between the coordinates. We've rectified that. To address a couple of the comments that have come up, since Thanksgiving, Little Wacomico Oyster Company has submitted 10 permit applications, like Mr. Stagg suggested. Some have already been approved without protest. Others are pending. So this is just another example of we're trying to do the right thing and continually work with staff and their recommendations. Based on the review from our initial application, we have reduced the footprint of what Mr. Stagg has shown in the presentation, and we agree with that footprint size. We also agree with all of the recommendations that he has proposed. We understand there might be one other issue that we would like to continue to talk about with the adjacent property owners in terms of that access, although one of the conditions does state that if they would like to put a pier or anything like that to give them access to the waterway, we would kind of reconfigure the sites in order to ensure that they have that access. So we are fine with that condition that's listed. We also understand that maybe if we consider reorienting the lines, that rather than parallel to shore, if we make them perpendicular to shore, that provides them even more small boat access, kayak access to their properties as they would desire. But we would like additional time to not only discuss that, but also to really work with Ben and all of the VMRC staff to ensure that we can move forward with a recommendation that they are happy with and not have a primary and a secondary. We want to be able to move forward with confidence and them have confidence in us and their industry in order to have that secondary recommendation move forward. I'll let Mr. Cockrell talk about the recent incident that Mr. Stagg brought up.
Mr. Cockrell?
Yeah, we had a little miscommunication on where those bags were supposed to go. They weren't supposed to go there. They were supposed to go on that approved site by the marina. But, you know, we took care of it, and, you know, we got some things we need to work through, and we would like to, if the commission will, we'd like to put this off and work with Ben and the staff to try to make sure that they're confident in what we're trying to do, make sure that all the signs up, make sure we're right, and bring us back to you at a later date.
So let me get it straight. You want to defer this issue, this permit issue, to a later date?
Yes, sir.
We certainly understand people that have come here to speak for a second time, and we would like to have kind of direct conversations with them to make sure if us considering to reorient the lines would address their kind of access to their property even further.
I was asked about this prior to the meeting, and the reason I brought this to the board was because of the individuals that were showing up to protest today. And it was my concern of wasting their time to come down here constantly to protest something in front of their property. And I did not want to force them to have to come to Foreman Road from the Northern Neck 2 or 3 different times. I felt if you wanted to defer it, it would have been nice to defer it yesterday, where we could have had time to notify them not to show up today and have a little bit of courtesy. Trying to defer it the last minute when we walk in the door the day before a meeting wasn't, to me, showing much respect for their time and their effort as well. So I made the decision to bring it before the commission and let the commission decide whether or not this is going to be deferred or whether or not it's going to stay as is, and we're going to take it in consideration. So the matter, any questions you have for the applicant? Mr. Branson?
Thank you, Commissioner. On Area 3 to the south on the map that's shown, one of my big concerns about leasing in this area, and I talked to Chief Stagg about this, there's something like 40 docks. I don't know how many houses north of your plant there. You've got a better idea. I have not been up here, but looking at maps, I can tell there's probably in excess of 40 properties with docks or something. So it says nothing about the amount of vessel traffic that would be going up and down the Little Wacomico. But in Area 3 there, that's one of my big concerns. You showed a map, your agent showed a map where the proposed navigation was, and it cuts really close to that point. And one map that Mr. Stagg showed a significant amount of shoaling off of that. So I'm not sure if that navigation path is entirely accurate. But in Area 3, where that rectangle, almost rectangle is shaped, what's wrong with floating oyster aquaculture inside between the shoreline and that marked area? Is there something with the bottom makeup or contour? You know, instead of being a rectangle, if it came closer to the shore, the outside border, the mid-channel border, inside all up toward the shore like it did in Area 2. Can you tell me something about, because this is your backyard, you know it? You
Hold on
have
for a
to-
second, for 1 second. Mr. Branson, I think the matter for hand right now for discussion is whether or not we're going to allow them to defer it.
Okay, I
And then
understand.
we can continue that conversation.
Okay.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the matter before the board is whether or not we defer this to a later date for you to consult with the property owners and staff to get something more acceptable for them, acceptable for your operation, acceptable by staff. So I guess we got to get past the fact of whether or not we're going to allow this to be deferred.
It was brought to our attention that prior to this hearing, that the outshore boundary was a concern for navigation. So working with staff, those boundaries, as Mr. Stagg presented, have been brought further inshore. A new concern was raised that the inshore boundary might be a concern for those adjacent property owners. So that brought onto the discussion of, can we change the orientation of the lines to then make them feel better that they have better access through the lines
And I
rather
get
than
that,
around the
but
lines.
once again, let's stay on topic here. I need a motion to defer this before we go any further. If we're gonna defer it, there's no need to continue this conversation in front of this board today. However, if we are not gonna defer it, then we can go into these details. So
I have one question then, sir. Can I get a show of hands, Commissioner? How many people are here to speak for or against this application in the audience?
Can I get a show of hands of who opposed this project? Can I get a show of hands of how many are support it?
'Cause these are the folks that are going to be impacted by deferment or.
Right. And I think that's where my position is to make sure we stay on topic. Is the board going to move to defer? It matters before the commission. That being said, I do not see a motion to defer. So the matter is before the commission. Now you can ask, continue on with the questions about the site and the project and the permit.
Thank you, Commissioner. You understand what I'm asking about? I know you redrew the lines based in coordination with the Marine Resource staff to bring that line from mid-channel a little bit closer. But the waters inside between the shoreline and Area 3, is there bottom makeup or is it conducive for that? I don't know if it's shallow, too shallow.
The inshore is fine. We use that for bottom gauges all the time. In the wintertime, we don't use this particular area in the summer because they won't, the oysters won't live on the bottom in the summertime there, but they'll live okay in the surface. So we could move that, if we needed to. I don't think we're comfortable moving forward with this application if staff is against it. So I think we need to work on what we need to do to get staff's confidence. We want to be on the same page as VMRC and staff. So if we can defer it, I think we'd like to withdraw it. And if that's all right.
Mr. Stagg, you have any comment on that?
Certainly, we would accept a withdrawal. Withdrawal means the application's done. And they can certainly reapply in modified form, or they can meet with the landowners and me to work on a revised plan and reapply. Unless Kelsey says otherwise, I think that's acceptable.
So we don't need to move on a withdrawal.
No, he can withdraw it if he wants, but he is going to have to start it all over again, pay whatever fees again, all of that.
And so is your position to withdraw the application at this time?
Yes, sir.
That being said, we'll consider that matter off the agenda. However, I want you for a few seconds. There's been an awful lot of resources exhausted in this. With staff, law enforcement, you need to show a little bit more respect to the staff here at MRC to make sure you understand that they're already taxed enough. We can't keep doing this over and over again. Make sure you get your stuff right. Get with Ben and his folks, and respect their time and efforts because they have a million other things going on. And also respect the time of your neighbors that have to come down here that don't want the project in front of their yard. Please get with them. Do your due diligence before you come back before us, because I don't want to be dragging these people back down here from the northern neck and wasting their time again for something that we could have postponed this yesterday. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We feel the same way. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Go ahead, Mr. Erskine.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I appreciate the applicant, coming before us and looking at maybe his recent incident and some of the past issues that he's had. I think aquaculture is extraordinarily important to this Commonwealth, but it has to be done in the right manner. And I appreciate you recognizing that maybe this isn't the right application at the right time. And I appreciate the protestants, coming down. There may be a way forward, but I think it's prudent to go back to the drawing board and see what can be done. And I would point also to the history of noncompliance, some of the other areas that Mr. Stagg brought up. I think a focus on that would be beneficial. An industry reputation is only as good as the compliance. So I appreciate, everybody's due diligence on this and the effort that it took. So Thank you.
Thank you. Next item, Mr. Stagg. I'm sorry, Mrs. Lutz.
I need to recuse myself from this matter as a personal interest in one of the applicants.
For the record, flag, Ms. Lutz, please recuse yourself.
Okay. So this is a oyster ground lease transfer request, something a little bit different. As you've seen a few of these in the recent past, as I've stated, and I'll state again for the new members, even though they're industry people, so they probably know it, the law was changed relatively recently related to transfers. It used to be an administrative process. We just transferred leases based on one person wanting to transfer it to another. We didn't ask a lot of questions. We just transferred it with some paperwork exchange. The law was changed where we have to consider now other factors, 1205 of the code, one of which is impact to adjacent property owners. So for transfers, we now do notify adjacent property owners and adjacent leaseholders when there's a request for a lease transfer, and they do have a chance to comment and object. And that is what we have in this particular instance. So this is a request from Susan Kellum and New Inlet Incorporated to transfer Ms. Kellum's interest solely to New Inlet Incorporated for a lease in the Gulf area of Northampton County. It contains 161.34 acres, and it is protested by a local waterman and adjacent leaseholder, Mr. James, Thomas James III. So again, the lease is located here at the mouth of the Gulf into the bay. Again, that's our mapping with the topo map and the lease highlighted and some of the information concerning the lease. So it is to the west of Eastville, again, in the Gulf water body. A little closer view of the lease itself with aerial photography and the lease outlines. This large lease that goes up into the creek is the subject lease. This is a copy of the actual plat of the survey of the ground. This was originally a couple of pieces of ground that were combined with some additional application area and all resurveyed together back in 1994. We did receive this application for transfer in May of this year. As required, as noted earlier, we did notify the adjacent leaseholder and nearby property owners. We did receive a letter from Hunger Seafood, the principal of whom is Mr. Thomas James III. We received that letter on May 26th, and he objects to the transfer. In his letter, he did state that he had previously subleased portions of this ground from the prior leaseholder who died in 1995. He subleased it from 1995 to 2013 when he was asked to vacate the subleased area after the death of the prior leaseholder. And I believe that was Mr. Kellum. He further states that he has searched for other suitable grounds throughout the shore and has applied for around 20 parcels totaling up to 250 acres, one just landward of the subject lease under review. He further noted that he's received leases on only 5 of those parcels to date for only a total of 7.58 acres, and that he has 3 applications that are still pending. There were some applications that were denied. He further alleges that portions of the subject lease have laid dormant where he previously subleased by the current leaseholder and any subleaseholder that they have allowed to use the lease. He states further in his letter that the Code of Virginia 28.2603 requires leased areas, quote, be occupied for the purpose of planting or propagating oysters. And the code also notes that anywhere the word oysters is used, it can mean clams as well. He further stated in his opinion that the currently unoccupied areas of the lease will continue to remain that way. He also contends that at the end of each 10-year lease term, that the commission can reduce the size of the lease based on our use requirement policy for a number of reasons, of which he believes lack of use of specific areas should be considered. The commission did adopt the use guidelines related to the 10-year renewals, but this specific point that he makes is not addressed specifically in that document. Additionally, staff and the full commission, when asked in the past, have been reluctant to supplant their opinion, either staff's or the commission's, on the method and use of a leased area, provided they do state that they plan to attempt to propagate shellfish on the lease. So in other words, we don't specifically typically comment on the nature of the bottom and whether it's good, bad, or ugly. That it's, if the applicant's applied for it, it's up to him to make it productive and for him to decide, or her to decide, what areas they're requesting. So specifically, leaseholders do often use only portions of their lease for all kinds of different reasons. Rotational harvest, to let some of the ground recover from intensive aquaculture use, use of areas just for nursery purposes and not for direct harvest, temporary holding of shellfish, wet storage on portions of the ground that may not be suitable for actual propagation, including areas that they plan to expand to in the future, and they're just not up to scale yet to use all of the ground, and other reasons that are not mentioned. While staff is sensitive to Mr. James' concerns about available areas for shellfish production, propagation limitations, both on vacant ground and through the lease application process for currently leased areas and through negotiation with existing leaseholders, reducing the size of this lease does not seem warranted based on current policy of VMRC, and that the prospective leaseholder has stated an intention in a letter to us that they do plan to use more of this lease in the future than is currently being used for propagation. So basically, our staff recommendation is that while we are sensitive to the protestants' concerns about availability of ground for lease or sublease, a sublease is considered a private transaction between two parties that the agency does not get involved in. It is also our policy to assess lease ground subject to the transfer request using the commission-adopted guideline document. This document considers use of the entire lease based on a per bushel, per acre, per year effort during the current lease term. This subject lease meets that criteria. Additionally, the transfer request is simply to transfer one of the current leaseholder's interest entirely to the other current leaseholder. Staff recommends transfer of the entire lease as requested. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Mr. James is here, and I believe he has a presentation.
Mr. James?
Raise a pointer so you can point at some things.
Yes.
Okay. You can either hit the left button and then
Please state your name and speak and raise your right hand, please.
Thomas Hezekiah James III.
Swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Proceed.
It's good. I'm Thomas James. Just kidding. Okay. You know, lifelong resident of the Eastern Shore, long history on the shore, worked in aquaculture through college, graduated from ODU. I'm involved in various community-based activities. In 1994, you know, after graduating from college and getting a job, I met with Edward Kellum, who was the previous, well, co-owner or co-leaser with his son, Timmy, and was in this area. This, of course, is a 2021 or 2001 image. It's, don't have images back that far. This is a parcel that I currently am leasing. And this was the parcel that I was leasing at that time. I didn't get this until 2009. At that time, you know, there was plenty of flow going across Hunger's Beach. But over time, the sandbar has started to cut in and cut the flow off. You can see where I had a lot of clams planted on this lease. And the sandbar was slowly creeping in at the time that I wound up getting that, and then the flow was cut off. It went from 18-month to 2-year cycle to almost a 3-year grow-out cycle. 2010, I was able to acquire this ground, shown on the previous plat under ACUF, from VIMS. Actually, they turned it over to VIMS. In 2013, Mr. Kellum passed. His portion went to his daughter, Susan, and that was at that time, you can see I was subleasing a large portion, and was also using, the new ground that I had acquired. And then I was instructed to vacate. It took a couple years to finally get all of my gear and stuff off there, but by 2016, I was off. I had been in discussions up until recently with Susan Kellum about, acquiring more. She had about a 10-year lease agreement with New Inlet. At the time, she was, once that was up, which would have been in 2023, she was willing to break apart her portion. I think she said she had been in discussions with VMRC as to how to do that. I was surprised when I did see the lease transfer come up, called her, asked her what was going on. She was concerned about sustaining a revenue stream, an income stream. So she made an agreement with New Inlet that if she transferred hers over, they would continue to, I guess, provide her with some type of stipend. Like I said, as you can see, in 2016, sandbars encroaching in. I've moved off, and I'm losing. This is what the property would have been, when I got it in 2009, 2017. I've lost about 25 feet a year, and then, more. This is the overall plat as of 2016. I had actually provided this with Susan when she was looking to divide it up, just to let her know, don't let them sticky with ground that's not worth having. And you can see by 2016 where they had oyster cages and clam planting. This little green strip down here was a parcel that I had applied for. I've since gotten that little strip on there. So 2015, I started searching for new ground. Certain criteria you got to look for. Mainly one is ease of access. Distance. Of course, you always got to worry about the SAV, availability of ground. And launching points. There are very few public launching points on the Eastern Shore. This is the current one at Smith Peach. It's not really public. It is private for the residents, but I do have an agreement with the landowner of that to do it. So I've tried to concentrate my efforts starting with here. But you've got Bayford for Nassauwatics, a lot of stuff on the seaside, Cape Charles, what have you. These are all the applications that I had applied for. I've spent in excess of $16,000 trying to acquire ground, only to get about 8 acres in addition to the parcel that I got in 2009. This has all started in 2015. VMRC promotes aquaculture. I want to continue in the business. Would like to continue to expand. Certain requirements are that the boundaries be marked where there are structures, that they not extend above 12 inches, and they can't be more than having an adverse effect to navigation. When I started in '94, you used to be able to come out of the Gulf and head right to here. Now you've got to circle all the way around to here. So it has been effect on navigation. Constantly go out there and you see cages that are stacked or upended. Though they're in their marked boundaries, they're still more than 12 inches out of the water. These are, 3 different occasions where this has occurred just in the past 2 months. This is where their current boundary is staked off. I've come across a couple of lines of abandoned, what appear to be abandoned or forgotten cages as a hindrance to navigation. High tide, you don't really see them. They're not clearly marked, if you wouldn't even say that they're marked at all. You can kind of make out a line in the water at low tide. So these are the two lines of abandoned cages. Here you can kind of see them under the water. There is a tiny little float here. That's them there. There's more cages out. And this is pictures taken from outside of their boundaries. So the cages that they've either forgotten about are well outside of where they have currently areas staked. When I got a piece of ground up in Mattawoman Creek, or up at the mouth of Mattawoman Creek, which the current landowner is trying to trying to transfer with me, so he wants me off his shoreline and wants to put me on a different piece away from his. I keep getting the notification that they'll not renew if you haven't used the ground, significant use of the ground in 10 years. This, like I said, was the area where I was, hold everything off. You can see not a whole lot of activity has happened since I left. You can see where New Inlet was using the ground, and then it's less and less. This is without the overlay. It seems like they maxed out at 2016, and then they've been tapering off until you get to, well, this is the most recent VMS survey. You can see the abandoned cages out there. Like I said, this was at their height. The abandoned cages, you can kind of see where they've reduced down to now. I was just interested in getting ground back for here. I mean, right now the ground that I have of the almost 5 acres, 4.95 acres, it's only about 2 acres of usable ground. Each of these squares is about 2 acres out of the whole. They had another transfer that happened up in the creek. I didn't have any issues with that. They were using that. That's where they seem to be expanding to for oysters and clams. But this area right here just seems to be, laying fallow. This was the letter that Mr. Stagg sent to me, saying their recommendation about the reason for supporting. When I had to renew this ground back in 2018, that's the 4.95 acres, I had to fill out an affidavit saying that I was using the ground, how much of it I was using, and all that. But the way that the current system is set up, and I'm glad that they do now require a transfer to be public notice, and I have friends that were in this industry, and for lack of a better term, they were playing the game. You add a name, it resets the clock. You change a name, it resets the clock. This has always been me. So if you don't wait for it to come up for a renewal, you don't have to fill out this affidavit. You don't have to state, I'm using this amount of ground. 9 years and 11 months, I can add a name to it. It starts the clock back again, and you don't have to state. You can let the ground sit empty for generations, so long as every 9 years and 11 months, you change a name. And there's no accountability. So there's plenty of ground out there that's just not being used. This just happens to be a parcel that was, I guess, near and dear to my heart. And it is usable ground. And it appears for a good portion of it, and I realize it's not the sole purpose, but, they're keeping the ground to keep other people from using a portion of it. If you're not going to use the ground, then give it up. If I've got ground that I don't think is any good, then I'm going to let it go. Or if I can find somebody else that wants it and use it because they want to do oysters, because it's better for oysters, like a parcel I have up in Hungers, then that's fine. And I'll be willing to swap it over. But, from what I've seen, their continued layout is a hindrance to navigation. With the way that they're with the cages, they're kind of being poor stewards of the ground. They're preventing other legal uses. I don't know how much expansion that they're planning on doing on the ground, but from everything I've seen, they're actually retracting in the area out front and have expanded up in the creek, which is better growing ground. If I could have gotten that ground, that would be great. The little strip that I've got in the Gulf, works wonders. It's a little bit harder out front with the shifting sands. And there are adjacent leaseholders down from me that have the same problem with the sandbar approaching in, and we're losing ground. And I can't expect the commission to go out there and dredge the sandbar back and get the flow back through to what it was. So, but if there's ground that's not being used, there's got to be some mechanism in place with
Go back
which
to
to.
the last slide, please, the previous slide.
Let's see here.
That top rubric you got there, where'd you cut and paste that from?
That one came from, that one came from here.
All right, go back to it. Read it. It says, during any portion of a 10-year period immediately prior to the application or renewal. Didn't say it, every single, and you haven't even showed us a 10-year flash yet. You haven't gone back to 2012.
Well, they didn't have it as of 2012.
There's been work on that ground since 2012, and we're in a 10-year snapshot right now. We're still within that 10-year snapshot, because 2024, were your earliest pictures were 2014, when there were cages on the ground, or clams planted.
Mhm.
So I would just wanted to say that this ground hasn't gone unworked in 10 years. Is that correct, Ben? This ground hasn't gone unworked completely in 10 years?
So let me clarify one thing. He's right, we do require a 10-year lease renewal form, which he showed. With a transfer, there's a separate form, it's a little different than the 10-year, but we do ask both the current leaseholder and the prospective leaseholder, how have you used the ground, how do you plan to use the ground? And they did fill that out, and they had quite a considerable amount of harvest previously on this ground over the entire term, within the 10-year term they were in.
Yeah,
So-
which the pictures kind of satisfy that, because you can still see some activity on it. I have no further questions. Is there any questions for Mr. James from the board? No questions? Thank you, Mr. James. Is the applicant or an agent for the applicant present? Come forward, please. Please state your name for the record and the speaker, and raise your right hand.
All right, my name is Kenneth Terry. I'm the owner of New Inlet.
You swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
Proceed.
Okay, there's not much to say. We acquired the ground when John West died. We acquired his company and the ground. Then we acquired Timmy Kellum's half, and we're in the process now of acquiring his sister's half. Except for the years 2016, 17, and 18, when the dam burst and we had an influx of fresh water from the pond, when we lost an awful lot of clams and oysters, that ground has been in continuous and heavy use, which our annual reporting shows. We started out with 2 clam growers there, and we now have 4 clam growers and 3 oyster growers. We're continually expanding. I don't really see a point in Mr. James's protest, but we're well within the definition of what the VMRC asks us to do.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. Is any questions from Mr. Terry, from the commission? Mr. Erskine?
Mr. Terry, so is it my understanding that you've been in production on this lease with Ms. Kellum for a number of years?
Yes, we have.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? Thank you, Mr. Terry. Anybody else for or against this project before we move forward? Matters before the commission.
I move to approve staff recommendation.
Mr. Meyer, motions to approve.
Second.
Second by Mr. Headley. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Thank you. Next matter. We're on public comment. So we're on public comment. Yep, so this slide is allowed for any matters to come before the board, commission, from the public. Is there anybody here that would like to meet? to speak during public comment session? Come forward, please. How you doing, sir?
I'm okay.
Please state your name for the record and raise your right hand, please.
William B.J. Carwatt Jr.
You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir. I'd first like to thank y'all, Mr. Commissioner and Commissioners and the people in the audience here to let me speak for a second. Much as I run my mouth, I got stage fright, so please bear with me. We have a cancer in the bay. The bay is a body of water, just like a human body. If you do not take care of the cancer, what happens to the human body? It dies. The bay will die. Memorial Day weekend, I spent from 7 o'clock to 4 o'clock at Huntington Park, James River Bridge. The parking lot holds 150, 200 cars and trailers. There's only like 25 cars and trailers there. Somebody from Virginia Marine Commission was there with their family, and he heard what I'm saying. All day long, people were asking, how come you're not fishing? You know, why, you know, what's going on? And people say, well, price of gas. And everybody said, that's all they heard, price of gas. They didn't hear the other part of it. The other part of it was, there's no fish. The croakers were 5 inches long. You're not gonna pay $6 a gallon to come fishing all day to catch little 5-inch croakers. You cut the head and tail off, you got 3-inch fish. It's just, you know, we're not harvesting like the Japanese do in the ocean that kills everything. Well, get back to the point of that, the cancer. The Midhaven fishing is disturbing the food cycle. Bear with me, I got to find. Dr. Brian Watts, professor at William & has stated, it's killed the birds. The marine birds are dying, they're leaving. Every time that Midhaven boat dredges, puts the net out, the bottom of the bay looks like the damn moon. It's killing everything. We don't have the fish here. People in this room probably know somebody. They don't fish no more in the Chesapeake Bay. They don't fish in the Hampton Roads. They go 20 to 80 miles offshore to go fishing. They leave at 5 o'clock in the morning, they come back 5 o'clock afternoon. They just don't fish the bay no more. Y'all have reports out here, I got reports that's here, from y'all's commission saying that the Midhaven fishing is deleting the fishing in Virginia. And this is another report. Overharvesting of Atlantic Midhaven in the Chesapeake Bay by Mega has a cost-wide impact at 60% or more of the striped bass Atlantic Ocean being a spawn in Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. And according to the ASMFC, striped bass are in poor health condition, overfished, underfished, all of that. Y'all have released a report about the disease, the skin disease on fishing, the rockfish. Then, meanwhile, overharvesting Atlantic Midhaven by Omega, reduction of fishery has also advisory impacted the recreational fishing business based for the entire Atlantic coast. That comes from the Mid-Atlantic Fish Corp people. It's here, people. The truth hurts, common sense prevails. If you don't take care of the cancer, down the road, people will be asking children, grandkids, everybody, well, why did the bay die? Couldn't somebody do something about it? It can be done. Just like the doctor tells you, you have a cancer, you go take care of it. We have a cancer, and now it needs to be taken care of. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
I hope I didn't make nobody upset or mad, but I can only state truth and facts, I mean, statistics.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Y'all have a good day. I got babies.
Anyone else want to speak during the open public comment session? Mr. Morris, no need to be quiet now. I guess we'll move on to the next one. I think this is for you, Alicia. Yes. Number 8, recommendations.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This is a request for funding from our commercial license fund. The Marine Fishing Improvement Fund, you'll hear us call that the commercial license fund, is made up of funds collected from the sale of commercial fishing licenses in Virginia. It can be administered by the Commission for a number of things laid out in the Code of Virginia, but that includes the management and improvement of marine fisheries and the education of commercial fishermen. And there are sufficient funds in that fund for this project. We received an application from VCU for funding for an Virginia ocean-based commercial fisheries coordinator. Now, this is personnel support that will help with our agency to provide capacity as it relates to offshore wind development and other issues with ocean use. That can be incredibly time-consuming for our own staff, so that would be alleviating some of the burdens our own staff have felt on these issues. Could be upwards to 20 or 30 hours a week, sometimes just in conference calls. Issues going on, ocean-based issues, we have a number. Virginia's ocean plan is definitely one of them, but probably the most pressing is the construction beginning soon on the commercial lease for the Seaval project. So the details is we have a coordinator proposed that has experience in both offshore wind and specifically our commercial fishermen. And there is a specific deliverable in addition to assisting with staff, in addition to outreach and education with the commercial industry, but also coming up with a good strategy document of how the next steps, what our agency should do moving forward as it relates to changes in that offshore energy development and ocean planning. The cost of the project would be $48,948. That's the request today from the Marine Fishing Improvement Fund. If you have looked at that application in your packet, there is a match associated. This is very typical for universities. There's a relatively high indirect cost rate of 45%. We do cap that in our own grant programs at 25%. So any of that unrecovered IDC, we just consider as match. So that's where that money coming from is match, which brings that total higher. What is requested at this time is the $48,000 from our improvement fund. We have received a number of public comments. Mr. Commissioner?
Please.
This is not a public hearing, but we do accept comments on any of our proposals. Staff has received 7. They're all in favor. They represent a number of fishermen and different companies. Some of these companies are outside Virginia, but all of those do note in their comments that they work with Virginia licensed fishermen, licensed and permitted fishermen. So this presentation is relatively short. We can accept any questions, but the staff recommendation is funding the proposed project totaling $48,948 from the Marine Fishing Improvement Fund. Questions for me?
Thank you, Alicia. Any questions for Alicia from the commission?
Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. I would like to add, I'm sure Pat is very aware, we've probably gotten a lot more of these probably in the last 2 or 3 hours too, so in support, all in support, obviously. So the recommendations you're looking at, this is just a small sample of them. I think Pat and I's email has exploded. Okay, everyone, matters for the commission.
Move to approve staff recommendation.
Mr. Monner moves to approve staff recommendations.
I'll second it.
Mr. Headley seconds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you. Well, that's it. That kind of wraps it up for July. Thank you guys for coming. July went by fast. Thanks for the new members. It did. Thanks for the new members. Appreciate your service and help. Thanks for everybody coming. We'll see you all again. If there's no further business, we'll adjourn until August 23rd, 2022.